Bienvenue. Thank you everyone for coming to the 46th event of Disrupting Disruptions, the Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Technologies Practices Speaker and Workshop Series. I'm Dr. Alex Ketchum, and I'm a professor of feminist and social justice studies at McGill and the organizer of this series. The Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Technologies Speaker and Workshop Series seeks to bring together scholars, creators, and people in industry working at the intersections of digital humanities, computer science, feminist studies, disability studies, communication studies, LGBTQ studies, history, and critical race theory. We are hosting 10 virtual events this fall. You can find our full schedule as well as video recordings of our past events at disruptingdisruptions.com. So that's the redirect URL, disruptingdisruptions.com. The other URL is way too long to remember. You can also find our list of sponsors, including Shirk, Milieu, Mila, and the Indigenous Futures Lab on our website. For this event, recording is enabled so that the event can be embedded on our website. Dr. DeChief will begin with a presentation. During the second part of the workshop, participants will be broken into small groups via breakout rooms in order to workshop their op-ed ideas. Then we'll come back together to discuss. Only the first part of the workshop will be recorded, however. You're welcome to attend just the first part if you prefer. Since this event is a Zoom meeting rather than a Zoom webinar, which we normally use, if you raise your hand to ask a question and don't want your face to be in the recording, we recommend that you leave your camera off. You can also type a question into the chat area and we will try to speak to that. Thank you to our captioner for today, Yvonne. Past series speakers Suzanne Kite and Jess McLean have pointed to the physical and material impacts of the digital world. While the events this semester are virtual, everything that we do is tied to the land and the space that we are on. We must always be mindful of the lands that the servers enabling our virtual events are on. Furthermore, as the series seeks to draw attention to power relations that have been invisibilized, it is important to acknowledge Canada's long colonial history and current political practices. The series is affiliated with the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies of McGill University. We are currently located in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. Furthermore, the ongoing organizing efforts by Indigenous communities such as the Wet'suwet'en people at Unistoten Camp make clear the ever-present and ongoing colonial violence in Canada. Interwoven with this history of colonization is one of enslavement and racism. This university's namesake, James McGill, enslaved Black and Indigenous peoples. It was in part from the money he acquired through these violent acts that McGill University was founded. These histories are here with us in this space and inform the conversations we have today. I encourage you to learn about the lands that you are on. Nativeland.ca is a fantastic resource. Now for today's event. Dr. Diane DeChief is the Science Communication Specialist at the Office for Science Education at McGill University. She was formerly faculty lecturer at McGill University's Writing Center, where she designed, taught, and coordinated writing courses focused on science communication and digital genres. Please join me in welcoming Dr. DeChief.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. And I'm excited that there's so many of you here today. So I'm glad to be able to talk about this topic. It's one that's pretty dear to my heart. So we're thinking about ways to share our views, share our perspectives. And I mean, part of my goal today is to kind of give you some, support and encouragement, and hope that some of you will go on to, pitch and get published some of the perspectives that you have. I'll talk a little bit about sort of the whys and hows of writing and pitching op-eds. And I look forward to hearing from you a bit too.
It's okay.
Okay, so we'd plan to use the chat for part of our activities, but I think it's not actually enabled. So we're going to, if it's possible for people to sort of like unmute and share these things, I'll just put a couple questions I wanted to ask you in order to sort of gauge who's here today and be able to sort of better temper things for our particular group. So I'll just go through. So I'm curious sort of where people are tuning in from and what are your current sort of roles. So are you a student? Are you teaching? Are you a parent? What kind of communities are you part of that you're interested in sort of writing and expressing about? So that would be great to hear from people about. I'll just put the 3 questions in so people can kind of respond to these things at once. I'm curious what kinds of news you're currently reading or engaged with. So it could be podcasts. These don't need to be sort of traditional news sources, but when we think about, pitching op-eds or sharing our ideas, it's always best if this is within a sort of newscape that you're already comfortable with and familiar with and have a sense of like what would work well for an audience of a piece. And then the last one is, do you already have a topic in mind? Are you already thinking about what it is that you'd like to write and share about? So I think we have time if people, whoever would like to sort of like introduce themselves and respond to those questions, I'd be really happy to hear from you. I'm not sure how to, maybe just jump in or put up a hand, or maybe my co-hosts will help sort of move through people too. So anyone want to go first?
If you want to put up your hand, there's the reaction button at the bottom of your screen. So you can see who's interested.
And you don't have to answer every question if you don't want to, just sort of to get a sense of maybe especially sort of what you're reading or what kinds of topics might be of interest. Okay, is this more of a listening crowd? And because if it is, that's okay too. I can proceed. Okay, I know sometimes people are like, "Oh, go ahead, great, thank you."
I'm Gala. I am based in Cambridge, and I actually am a data scientist, but I write blog posts about my work, and that's why I'm here. And the type of news I'm reading this week, especially, is about COP26. And I've got lots of stuff I want to share my opinions about. I just don't quite know how.
Awesome. Thank you. We'll go through some of the how here. So great to hear. And yeah, I think many eyes are on COP26 right now. It's great to bring that up. Oh, great. So somebody was added, we can also annotate. So if anyone wants to make notes on the slide, that's cool too. You can sort of jot things down around the questions if you'd like to. Anyone else up for sort of sharing either with their voice or with the annotation tools? All right, I can continue just to make sure we can get through all the material over the lunch period, but happy to hear from anyone else who would like to introduce themselves. I'll give you a little overview of what's planned for today. So I'm going to give a tiny bit of background on sort of how opinion pieces came to be. It's been a tradition since about the 1970s, and then why we should be writing them, why all of us here should be writing them, and then focus more on how to do it. So we'll talk a bit about pitching, more on structure and style, and then an extra bit on persuasion, because we're talking about a persuasive form of writing. And we'll move into next steps afterwards. So this is where we can sort of think through and plan some of our ideas out. Okay, so how opinion pieces came to be. So there's a little contention about whether they were started in the New York Times or in London, and the kind of the story that I'll share today is that they came to exist in the New York Times in 1970. At the time, there was a lot of social unrest in the United States. Probably many of you know more about this than I do. And there were the New York Times traditionally very strong subscribers. The number of subscribers was falling off a bit. They realized there was a more kind of like fractured mediascape, and they wanted to get more people reading their paper again. So there was sort of this interest in raising subscriptions. So traditionally, and we see this, this continues, there's a page, often it's kind of like page 2 of the paper. We're talking about those physical papers, but on page 2, or even a little further in, there was a page where the editors would sort of tell the readership, potentially like how to vote if there was an election, or their views on certain kinds of events or circumstances. That was called like the editorial, and it was from the editors of the paper. It was often not signed by an individual. It was just kind of, you knew who was on the editorial mast, and this was the people, or these were the people putting this editorial together. So the thinking was that there could be a greater diversity in readership if more diverse voices were being, shared on the newspaper pages. So what the editors did is set aside the page opposite of the editor's page. So there was a spot for the editors. Over on the right-hand side, they decided to put the opposite the editorial page, and that is how op-ed came to be, opposite the editorial. And this was the space where they would publish, more diverse perspectives from, the broader range of communities that exist. So the goal worked. They did increase subscriptions, and then there were more letters to the editor, which has been seen, the number of letters of the editor has been seen as sort of a way of gauging, sort of social engagement, who cares about what's happening. The only challenge was that this diversity of voices still wasn't particularly diverse. There were still very male dominated. Not many people of color were represented, and the rate of pay for publishing one of these editorials or one of these op-eds has been maintained at $100 for a very long time. I don't think it started at quite 100, but it's just stayed there because the value in being published in those pages is so much greater than the dollar sum that many people want to have their voices heard on those pages. So this is kind of the background. This is how they came to be. And then since that time, opinion pieces have really branched out. So we can see in the Canadian landscape, there are quite a few different opportunities to write opinion pieces, but we also have analysis pieces, commentary pieces. So there's often a bit more detail, a bit more sort of individual research that's drawn on in analysis options. And they don't have to have such a stringent structure that op-eds tend to have. So we'll talk a little bit more about those structures as we continue. That's the sort of background. And the next thing that I'll do is I'm just going to point you towards this amazing organization that has done a lot to increase the diversity of who's writing opinion pieces. So it's called the Op-Ed Project. I was going to drop the link in the chat, but if you just Google Op-Ed Project, you'll get their website. And you'll see that I'm drawing directly from it here. So they have this awesome view that, the story we tell becomes the world we live in. And when the story is told only by a few voices, that's who's directing how the world evolves. So they're working very hard to have more folks who might not pitch, might not get published, have their pieces at least on the editor's desk so that they could be selected. And then in some cases, they've had some really great impact too. So I'll show you that on the next slide. But I love this, that their second bullet here is the world becomes more intelligent when it's more inclusive, and that the best ideas should have a chance to be, read more broadly. So this is, there's great resources there that we can draw on even in today's presentation. And then I'll just note the impact that they share on their website too. So actually, I took a workshop with the Op-Ed Project. This is probably my initial trigger. I was thinking it was 2008, but it was probably 2009. I don't think it was the first year that things opened, but I'm one of the 17,000 people who have had some training through the Op-Ed Project. And what they've found is that since 2008, the number of bylines for opinion pieces by women in particular has increased from 15 to 26%, and that the Op-Ed Project is considered one of the kind of main reasons this has happened, is that there is this kind of education. And the fellow, or the sort of training that I took was just a one-day event, but they have a lot of really awesome programs. So it's definitely worth checking them out in terms of sort of mentorship opportunities and longer running programs that can really ensure that people's voices are heard, and that we can be as compelling as we want to be, and as persuasive as as is necessary to get our points across. So that's my little push for the Op-Ed Project. And so this is the, how and why we should be writing these pieces. We should be getting them onto editors' desks to make sure that they can at least be considered in terms of publication. So we'll move next to the sort of how to do it. How do we go about doing this? And a big part of op-ed writing is pitching. So, many of us probably spend time sort of, speaking or writing out some of the ideas we have, some of the feelings that we have. And these things need to be in a fairly particular format in order to be effective in the kinds of genres or in the sort of genre format that we tend to read them in, but they also need to be pitched in a particular way in order for editors to sort of choose them and sort of choose to publish these pieces. So what to do here, this is sort of your sort of first steps when you're planning to do this, are to think about where you would like to see your op-ed published. Maybe make a little list of your top 3 locations. And then make sure to read the pitching guidelines of those publications. Each publication has its own specific guidelines that they publish. You'll want to check out sort of recent op-eds published there to see how these might touch on your topic, or if there's sort of formats that are of interest to you. And then some of the locations, so I know The Guardian is one, they don't want to receive fully written pieces. They want to have an idea pitched to them, and then they will kind of go back and forth with you to sort of evolve it and make sure that it matches their format. Whereas a lot of locations do like a fully written op-ed. And in those cases, they're pretty strict about the word count. So that's part of what you want to be looking for here with the pitching guidelines. And I do have a document, it's somewhat McGill specific, but I do have a document that we'll send out later that sort of goes through some of the different sort of common publications and some of the guidelines around them. So when you do pitch, and this isn't, this is sort of, in the future, this is coming up, but it's going to be important to say why you're sending this article. And a lot of people think about op-eds as hanging on a news hook. So they're always sort of like, what is the event that's making this urgent right now? Why does this matter currently? There are publications, I know Wired is one of them, that's just interested in people's ideas. They don't care so much about the news hook. But it's good to think about like, what makes this timely? Why is action critical at this juncture? So that's going to be an important part of what you're pitching, sort of why this matters now. It's also, I'm just going to jump over the story part for a second. It's also really important to show what your perspective is. So what makes you the best person to tell this story? So often I talk about op-eds with students, and students often feel like, well, I'm just a student, like who really cares what, what I have to say? But I think that the student ethos has a lot of power these days, more so I think at least than 20 years ago when I was a student. And so I think it is really important, if you're coming at it from a student perspective, or, if you're sort of don't think you're like the most, the person that should be writing about it, you probably are. Like there's probably good reason that your experience can evolve into something that's going to be important. So that's going to be something that you'll need to include, sort of like what's your angle, what's going to be of value with you telling this story. And then this last question, this so what, is a pretty important one for the editor to have a sense of why their readership will like this publication. So when you're pitching, it shouldn't be kind of a blanket pitch that goes to all the different publications, but you're going to want to tweak it for particular publications. So if there's a difference in where they're located and location plays a role, you're going to want to say like why this particular location matters, those kinds of things. The more you can kind of tie it to a particular publication, the more likely an editor is to want to sort of grab it and publish it. And the part that I skipped over initially is an important one, and I'd like us to think about this at the end when we're sort of, thinking through our ideas. I think I have it highlighted here too. Yes. So it's a lot of us can probably think of topics when we're talking about our op-eds. We can be like, oh, I want to write on this topic or this topic, but it's important to have an angle. So it's important to be like, what's your way in? What's the story that you're telling about that topic? So in the podcasting world, I've heard at least that this is called the XY formula. Alex, you might have a better sense if this is how people actually speak about it, but here's the topic and then here's the way in. So that'll be something to think through. I had an analysis piece published in the National Observer, I guess it's almost like 2.5 years ago or something, but the topic was about the name change that McGill University's male sports teams went through. And then my angle was that I wanted to hear it from the student organizer's perspective. So that was sort of, here's the thing, and then here's the piece that goes across, sort of like what's special about this. And we'll look at a couple of next examples as we go through, and we can think through like what their pitch might have been, what exactly they were suggesting as sort of their angle. So as we move into thinking about more kind of the structure of your op-ed, or sort of what pieces should be there, it's really valuable for us to sort of gather our own goals, or sort of like what's our purpose in thinking about people reading an op-ed and potentially acting on it. So not every op-ed will include all of these pieces, but there might be something you need to explain to readers, something that from your perspective you have a good understanding of and you want people to see it from your perspective. Sometimes, people often write op-eds, and even the person who introduced themselves mentioned being a data scientist. They might have insights that people outside of that specialization won't understand or won't know about. So it's going to be important sometimes to explain the science even. And then the next one is, what do you want people to remember? So if there's something that people are going to take away from reading your piece, what do you want that to be? What's the sort of gold coin they might take away and share with somebody else? What are they going to pass on in a conversation, or maybe, quote in the future? And then what do you want your readers to do? And so sometimes the doing is going to be thinking differently. Sometimes it might be voting for something. Sometimes it might be changing a behavior, but it should be, explicit to you, at least what it is you want people to do afterward. And part of the op-ed structure, we call it a call to action. So usually it's one of the final sort of leaves is you want to sort of tell people what you'd like for them to do. So it's good to kind of answer these questions for yourself before you begin writing. And then in terms of structure, this is kind of a weird diagram I made a bit ago. I will potentially revise it in the future, but anyway, this is the sort of key pieces. And you can find a similar kind of breakdown of these components on the Op-Ed project website. So in journalism, we have this, the opening that's referred to as a lead or a hook. And so this is where you want to think about something that's going to, give people a visual, bring people into a certain circumstance or a place, ask people to sort of disrupt their current beliefs. So you want something that's going to be kind of a strong opening. The next piece, this is an interesting one because it can be either implicit or explicit. So what is this about? So it's not going to be, the thesis statement like we might do in an academic article or something where there's something that's very clear about the purpose. But sometimes it is, kind of clearly argued too. We'll look at a couple of examples in a minute. But there should be something, usually it's fairly early, but some op-ed writers or columnists have this job, or they do it in a way where they kind of, you kind of get where it's going by the end, but it's not as clear at the beginning. And it kind of makes it harder for you to argue against it when something's not as clearly labeled. So I'm kind of a fan of the explicit thesis, but, there is room for this to be something that you're sort of like, okay, I think it's about this by the end. And sometimes this thesis or what the topic is comes through even in the title of a piece. So I'll show you an example in a minute. And then in the standard op-ed format, there's usually 3 assertions. There's usually sort of 3 points. They're kind of thematic. They're not usually based on time or anything like that. Like kind of a story structure might be a bit more sort of past, present, future, but these will just sort of be like 3 points I want to make. And it's important to order these in a way that usually the first and third are going to hit the hardest. We kind of like the first argument that you have is going to come through strong. The last one, people will have a sort of a takeaway or one they'll remember. And that doesn't mean that the second one doesn't matter, but it might be the one that you think has the less impact. It might be one where you're like, this one's not quite as strong. And for all of these, you'll want to support them in some way. We'll look in a minute at sort of some ways to support, but these are yeah, these are kind of short paragraphs. These are not necessarily particularly long, but they're going to be sort of your key arguments that support the thesis. And now op-eds have this funny thing where they have a kind of standard language, like "to be sure" is a common phrase that you'll hear. Op-ed writers have been referred to as one-handed writers. So in that way, it's meaning, it's not this sort of like, on one hand, we have this, on the other hand, we have this, but rather there's just this one argument that's being made. But this "to be sure" statement is a way of kind of looking like you're considering the other hand. So a to be sure statement sort of builds op-ed writers' ethos. It sort of makes you look like you're actually considering another argument, but really the "to be sure" is often something that you can sort of quickly dismiss. It's sort of like, people might say this, but here's why that doesn't matter. So there's often some kind of an argument that's included. Now, not every op-ed has a "to be sure," but if you look for those in different op-eds that you might read, you'll see that there's often a line that's almost exactly like that. Or some may argue that last piece underneath it that says "call," I'm referring to as the call to action. So this is where you're actually, sometimes it can be a direct statement to the reader, like, next time you're in this situation, you should do this, or, something that's a specific sort of focused call in those ways. Sometimes it's more of a should about society. So it doesn't have to be as directed towards individuals, sort of depending on your feeling and what your topic is. And then often the significance comes through again at the end, like what will happen if everyone does this thing you're asking for. There's potential to switch around the call to action and the significance also. Sometimes people find that it's more effective to have the call as the final point because it's one that people might sort of take away and carry forward. So those are that's the common structure. Now, if you were writing something more like a commentary or an analysis, it's not as critical to kind of adhere to this very kind of standard format. But what we tend to see as a formatting difference, oh, I forgot I have all these pieces to share with you here. What we tend to see is that the part with the assertion with sort of 3 points, this can be in more depth. So we tend to see that there's still most of the common pieces around the top and the bottom, but that there's going to be a bit more happening here. There might be interviews or quotes from people. There might be, one of the assertions might have a bit more hanging on it. There might be reports from research that you've done, but this tends to be the area that's more filled in and the other parts remain the same. All right, I just want to stop and ask if there's questions at this stage. And yeah, we would need, there's no chat, so we'd need to hear from you if there's anything you wanted to ask right now. And if not, I'm going to keep going.
I was just going to ask, when you're preparing to write it, do you use this structure to like start organizing, or do you do that kind of after you've had a brain dump?
Yeah, personally, I often do a brain dump first and then go through and look. And I have kind of like some leave questions at the end that you might want to discuss with other people. I would just write things down. I would think about, sort of like, what's my topic? What's my angle? What are some things I see that relate to it? And then I would go through and try to work on this structure. So I think this structure depends on the kind of writer you are. Some people find particular structures to be productive, but personally, I'm more like, I got a lot of stuff going on up here. I just want to get it out and see what's there, and then I can shape it into this. That's a great question to ask. Thanks for asking it. Any other questions before we move to the next part of the how?
Just a quick question, and I don't want to derail things, but is this quite different than how you would write, say, a blog post or some other types of writing? Or is this very specific to op-eds?
Yeah, I would say, there's a huge variety of kinds of blog posts. So I think blog posts could have this style. I would say a lot of the things around the language, like the kind of stylistic choices, will be similar to a blog. But this is if you look at op-ed pieces, they really follow this structure. So this is what editors are generally looking for. And I mean, as an op-ed writer, you don't have to follow this to a T, but it is important to know that this is the standard. This is kind of what editors are looking for. So if you're going to sort of shift it or play around with it a little bit, then it's important to be aware of that and to be thinking of what effect that has on an audience who's probably, used to this kind of, generally structure is kind of invisible to readers. Like we don't usually think about it unless we're the writers or we're the editors that are looking for certain things, but it's still there. It's still something that we're sort of like, expecting as readers. So I would say that stylistically it'll be similar to a blog, but yet this is kind of a standard format. And some blogs are persuasive and would do this, but yeah, generally I would say this is more really just like what an op-ed intends. And because op-eds were first, op-eds started, in the 70s, probably some blogs base more on what an op-ed is.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Thank you. All right, I'm going to carry on, but please feel free to ask questions too as I'm shifting slides. Okay, so I have examples of two different recently published op-eds, and I've taken what I think is the thesis of these two op-eds, and I was just going to share these with you so you could kind of see how this thesis looks, kind of like what it appears like. This particular thesis or this article was published in The Guardian this summer. And so the title is Native Children Didn't Lose Their Lives at Residential Schools, Their Lives Were Stolen. So it's sort of putting an actor in place in terms of thinking about what's happened. This is this is a Canadian focused piece where we have residential schools and residential school survivors. And the way that many of us have been taught to talk about these schools has us, kind of without an actor, without a subject who's done these harms. And this piece really focuses on the language of that. And what I found interesting as a thesis is that it's explicit, I find, this thesis, but it comes kind of more than halfway through this particular piece of writing. So I found that kind of interesting. It's not just like, second paragraph. And I think some of what I wanted to show you here was the language. So off the top where it's like one thing is clear. So it's kind of like, here's my main argument. This is one thing I want you to see as crystallized as I see it. And then it links back to the title. So you can see that the title is probably based on this piece that was written in the op-ed. And it kind of builds from it. So it goes on to sort of further extend it. So this is, I think, a very valuable thesis to consider, that this is a good example of it. And this is about the length of paragraphs that we usually see in opinion pieces. Opinion piece paragraphs don't tend to be, 5 to 7 sentences. They're often 2 or 3 sentences that are put together. I'm going to show you a second example as well. This one was published very recently, and I haven't heard a lot of feedback on it, but I think that there probably is a bit of a buzz. When I read this one in its entirety, I was a bit like, oh boy. So this one is called Feminist and Trans Folks Should Be Allies, So Why the Bitter Words? And this is published again in a Canadian context in the Globe and Mail very recently, so just last Saturday. And this is the thesis. And sometimes we can see theses in terms of this kind of language of like should. So it's like, must or should often comes through, where it's sort of like, this is how it should be. And you can see here, they're sort of linking to something more broad that people will know about or understand. In this case, in this opinion piece, this thesis came very early. So it was like explicit, I think, in the second paragraph that this one came through. Now, something that I think is interesting to think about is, what do you think these pitches were for these people's theses? So these authors would have pitched these before they were published. So I wonder, kind of how they went about pitching them. So, we can think there's a topic here, but then sort of like, what's the story? What's the piece that comes in? And it's interesting, especially as people in academia, which many of us are, I'm sure, often we think of things that are kind of technical or things that we theorize, but here it's kind of like, why aren't feminists and trans folk friends? And it's like, well, of course, in many cases they are, but it's this kind of simplified version that's been put forward. And it's like, why can't they be friends? And in the last example that we looked at, it's about residential schools, and then it's about the language that we use to talk about residential schools. So, that it's too gentle and casual, how we've been taught to use it. All right, so I'm going to move to think a little bit about style. So that question about blog writing and how it's similar and different has a lot to do with the kind of style that we often see op-eds written in. So it's going to be super important, I think, as I mentioned a little bit already, that we're using language that doesn't include a lot of technical terms, doesn't include jargon. There have been some recent studies that have shown that when people read jargon, they tend to feel like it's not written for them. They tend to be, feel like kind of outsiders at the party, and they often even start arguing against things that they read when this is in more technical language. So it's really, especially if you're trying to write something persuasively, you definitely want to think about people feeling like this is for them, this feeling like this is a conversation that they're included in. And of course, op-eds aren't always written for the people who have the same beliefs as you. More often, the goal should be, how do I make somebody see something differently? How do I get people to do things differently? So in that way, it's sometimes really thinking about what language does my audience use? How am I going to be able to have them connect with it? So as much as possible, this should be kind of colorful, emotional word choices that uses images and like based on words. And this is why that the question around, what order do you write these in? Do you sort of do a brain dump first? I find that my brain dump version is often going to be stronger in these ways. I'm often going to have more colorful or emotional language. It's more my feeling as I write those things down. So that's going to be something that's important. Now, I mentioned as my second bullet, the sentence structure. So in academic writing, we tend to have a lot of longer sentences and maybe more complex kinds of punctuation. But if we want to sort of have a stronger impact, it's really important to vary the sentence length, especially where you want to kind of have something resound. And often one short sentence is going to be powerful in that way. Even in the two example op-eds that I shared, and we'll put the full links in the email that we send out to you if you want to look at them again. But even there, I could see that there were one of the authors used short sentences at the end of each paragraph to sort of have like a bit of an impact, a bit of like, carry this idea away. And the other author used short sentences at the very opening of each paragraph. So you can see that there's sort of like a purpose and a reason to use short sentences. It's also great to use question marks. People don't do that enough in academic writing, but there's some awesome uses of question marks. Another thing that I'd have you think about is how you use pronouns. So the sort of, inclusive we or you, like these are kind of power words, sort of like who's invited into sharing this idea, who are you sort of situating in another way. The pronouns are going to make a big difference. And then the tone or the attitude that comes through, often these are pieces that are written with kind of a dire feeling. So you could see that the first example is like that we just looked at, it was more serious, and it was more, thinking about a very troubled history and a very, hard things to learn and read about, and, is pretty formal and intense in that way. Whereas the second one, it's coming at things in a bit of a humorous way that I think I found a bit off-putting, at least. So some people might enjoy it or engage in it, but think about what sort of mood is going to be carried through with your words. And sometimes, I think sometimes writers feel like we don't really intend to put a mood on it, but certainly readers still take something away. So it's kind of up to us as writers to insert the mood, sort of put in the words that are going to make a kind of feeling carry through. And then with op-ed writing, it's generally a more conversational. It's not a form. So it's not usually something that's very formal. It's usually, how would you say that to someone? And that's what you want to have carry through in terms of your language choices. We often see literary devices, especially metaphors, in op-eds, especially if you're explaining something to somebody, or if you're trying to, suggest how much something matters or something like that. You're kind of building from it, and we'll often see metaphors there. And then in terms of like supporting your assertions, it's a great thing to cite, and you'll see, some of the more hastily written kind of pieces like that might be citing things that are sort of, maybe a little less acknowledged or less mainstream. But it doesn't mean you can't work from those things too, especially if you're drawing on, people's lived experiences and so on. Yeah, I have a couple of friends who are writing columns regularly, and they cite a lot, and they try to find like the best sources that they can to really like support what they're arguing. But we can see sometimes there's very little in that way. And some content, some opinion pieces don't have to have a ton of citations either. It can be something that's a bit more kind of individual and lived that might not have that kind of backup. And it's something editors might ask for more or less of, depending on where things are going. All right, so we're still in the how. We're just moving on to think about persuasion. Now, this is potentially a familiar topic for some of you. So thinking about rhetoric and using language persuasively. And something that I've done often in classrooms is to have students think about how persuasion is happening in op-eds. And I think as op-ed writers, we might not think of our own sort of communication skills as being persuasive in these ways. So the next few slides are meant to sort of have you thinking about the kinds of persuasion that you could be using, the sort of variety that's at your hand. So we can think about rhetorical appeals that include logos, ethos, and pathos. So those are words that Aristotle used to term these things. So logos we can think about as logic or credibility. And this is has to do with two pieces in an op-ed. One of them is sort of the consistency or the order of an op-ed. So if people can easily sort of find their way through it or understand why things are ordered as they are, then that sort of helps the credibility of the writer or speaker, in that people can easily follow you. And then the other part is what you're using to sort of support your argument. So this is where you do want support, but some, especially first-time op-ed writers who are, more sort of academically based, often throw in too much support in ways. There tends to be like a lot of statistics, a lot of, things that are kind of hard when you're in this sort of reading more compelling pieces mode. You don't want to have a ton of numbers thrown at you, or you don't want to have sort of new ways of understanding something. You just want to be like, what does that mean? And if there are sort of numbers or statistics or measurements like about the size of something, it's going to be important to make sure it's something really relatable, that people can understand that very clearly. So besides that sort of logic and consistency, another thing is sort of how you put yourself forward in the piece, your sort of ethos, how you embed it. When we think about ethos, we can think about like a reputation or the credibility, credibility we were using with logos, but sort of, how your ethics, sort of how you're regarded. And this is where you want to, sometimes people use sort of like external ethos and sort of like, these are my degrees, this is who I'm affiliated with, this is the sort of research that I've done. Sometimes it's more about lived experiences. And if you're sort of treating your audience kindly as a writer, that goes a long way too. So if it doesn't seem like sort of an obnoxious kind of approach, it's going to, or if it comes across as you're taking this seriously, that can go a long way too. The second example of an op-ed I gave you, I think part of my like concern with it was that it seemed a bit sort of airy and a bit light for the topic. And then finally, pathos. And I would say pathos is a really strong one for op-eds. And this is how you connect emotionally with readers. And link to their imagination as well. So emotion and imagination, I think we can consider bound up in pathos. So this is where the word choice goes a long way. So using words that sort of create almost a sensory experience, or tell a story other people can kind of link to and understand. We also can see figurative language. So there's a lot of hyperbole, so kind of extreme language that's used in op-eds. You can see that come out. And that's often used to sort of like heighten emotions or make things seem all the more urgent. pathos often influences us the most, even if we think we're very logical and rational. We're also often still most moved by pathos. And this little triangle is just meant to sort of show the connection of these modes of persuasion, and that these appeals are often best used all together. Like, you kind of want a balanced sort of op-ed. Sometimes we can choose, when we look closely at op-eds, we can see like 2 of these are used the most in this particular op-ed and not so much the third one. Totally fine. But I think op-eds that just draw on one of the modes of appeal are not as strong. They tend not to be picked up or not to be published, and they tend to be less persuasive. So it's important to sort of consider all of these angles, that it's going to be stronger if you can kind of balance this bunch. All right. So I mentioned, these kind of 3 modes, and this is just sort of a summary slide for us to think about how these are used. And I'm just going to go back to the op-eds that I mentioned previously for us to see there's a sort of a paragraph in each of them where the authors sort of, configure themselves or sort of present their persona. So this is now the second example that I've shown first. And this first paragraph is the opening paragraph of the piece. And then the second one is where I think the sort of persona piece comes in. So I'll just give you a second to read it. So in terms of sort of rhetorical moves or sort of how things are positioned, you can see there's this sort of broader, like, here's the issue as the authors put it together, and then here's my position on the issue. So that positioning is part of the author's persona that they're putting forward. They're sort of letting the reader know where they are at. But even defining the problem in this way is part of their persona, right? They're sort of putting that through as well. But this is where it becomes more explicit, is in that second paragraph. And it's interesting with this particular piece too, that last paragraph had me thinking, or the last sentence in the second paragraph had me thinking things were going to go in one direction, but they didn't go there. They sort of carried on. So it was a little bit of almost a red herring, where it was kind of like, oh, is this what we're arguing? And then it was like, nope. So I'm just going to show you the second example now. So Erica Violet Lee, who's writing this piece about the residential schools and the language that's used in Canada to talk about them, fairly early in the piece positions herself as an Indigenous person, and then talks about the residential school that was part of her community. So that there's kind of this like, very close parallel to what she's writing about. So we can understand that she's somebody with expertise. She's somebody within a community that was, experienced the violence of residential schools. And even at the very end, I mentioned the pronoun use, but she mentions like, sorry, the window's over it. So our people, she includes. So she is part of the population that experienced this violence. But yeah, and that's even earlier in that sentence. So our lands assimilate us. So you can see, kind of where she's positioning ourselves. So that's going to be something to definitely consider as you put your op-ed piece together, is sort of how you are part of it. Where do you situate yourselves? How do you want your reader to see you? Okay, any questions about this part with the persuasion or anything to date? Feel free to unmute yourselves and ask.
I do have a question, if we can ask anything. Thank you so much for your knowledge and for sharing. This is all new to me. I'm Tawana. I'm an academic calling from Ann Arbor, University of Michigan. And, you know, you asked us, you know, where we were planning to write. And that's something I'm still exploring. I just had a question about, given the history of op-eds, should we strive to write in an area where we might not be, quote unquote, preaching to the choir or writing outside of our filter bubble? Like, should we aim to publish op-eds in those, so I guess so as to be persuasive?
Yeah, you know, it's a really good question. I think yes. Like, I think to have the most impact, it's going to be beneficial to think of your audience as people who are, you know, you want to persuade. Who do you want to have think differently? Because a lot of people don't know much about certain issues, or, you know, haven't read much about them. So it's like reading an op-ed that you've written might be the first that they know of this topic. So I feel like, you know, it's something that I think people get their sort of footing on as they continue it too, or as you're putting your piece together. But it is something that, you know, I think there's a greater benefit to think about a broader audience, and not necessarily, you know, like the people we want to smack down or something like that, but to think like there are a lot of sort of undecided people, or people who are like interested in a story related to a topic, and that, you know, you can engage them and influence, you know, potentially they're thinking right, you know, from the beginning, or potentially how they're going to filter other information on the same topic that they meet. So I think, you know, to think about a broad audience is best. So, you know, it doesn't mean, you know, go out there and be prepared for all kinds of abuse to come your way by publishing in something with a really alternative perspective from your own. But I do think, you know, putting things out at, you know, at the municipal, or, you know, in Canada, the provincial, or, you know, state or federal level is going to, you know, it's going to influence the most people. So in that way, I think, yes, I think it's good to go forward in those ways.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think sometimes though, like, especially when we're thinking through what it is we care about, what we want to write about, how we want to express ourselves, I think it's really great to talk with people about these things. So sort of like trusted friends, partners, you know, people, you know, I think start there and then sort of keep going, you know, like I'm thinking about, you know, writing a piece on this. What do you think of this? And, you know, sort of test the waters in terms of what seems compelling to people, what people respond to. I know the piece that I was mentioning, the analysis piece that I wrote a bit ago, I definitely kind of, you know, checked in with people, and I was interviewing Indigenous students at McGill about that topic. And I was like going, you know, I talked to a few different Indigenous folks, students and faculty members, and just sort of made sure I had, you know, kind of a good sense of the story. I am Indigenous, so I felt a little bit more comfortable writing about it, but it was also, you know, it's still a sensitive topic with a lot of feelings attached to it. So it was good to sort of test the waters and sort of see what kind of reaction I was getting and make sure I wasn't missing anything. So I would definitely say whatever you're writing about, just sort of, you know, test it out on people, like when you're having a meal together or on a Zoom call or something like that. And just sort of, I know a lot of our casual ways of interacting are a bit disrupted now, but it's good to verbally just sort of test it and see. All right, so I'm moving into sort of like things to think about as you start planning an opinion piece. So in terms of those persuasive elements, it's good to sort of plan your arguments. We talked about the 3 assertions earlier. So it's good to think about sort of like, what are some of the things I could argue and how might I support those things? And keeping in mind that we don't want too much data. In terms of the order, I mentioned earlier, I didn't call it this, but primacy versus recency, so that what comes early, people tend to remember and think about, and then what you leave people with also tends to stick. And that you can use hyperlinks in your articles to sort of support what it is that you're saying. In terms of ethos, like how would you let people know that you can be trusted to write on this topic? And then pathos, so how will you engage emotions? What are some images you might employ, or what are some words that you find powerful? And sometimes the words that we use in academia sound good in our academic circles, but they're not going to resonate that much with an outside audience. So, you know, if you've kind of coined a term that's, you know, has a, like it's a short phrase or 2 words, maybe you can introduce it in the op-ed, but maybe you want to think more about sort of non-specialist language or sort of like more accommodating terms that are going to get your point across better and not be too attached to those phrases that are valuable in our day-to-day work. All right, so in terms of thinking of next steps and thinking about planning an article, these are the things that I wanted you to sort of keep in mind. I was going to put this in the chat before we moved into breakout rooms, but you might want to take a picture of this or something like that so you can have it with you as sort of things to think about. So you might want to begin by thinking about sort of your topic and then the story of your topic. So, you know, what might you write about, and then what could your angle be? So that's where, you know, we can kind of see like topics are easy to conjure, but then sometimes your actual angle might need a bit of like framing and reframing to sort of settle on where you want to go with it. And then how might you use these modes of persuasion that we've talked about, or these rhetorical appeals? So what kind of support can you think of that would be good? What kind of arguments? How will you position yourself as somebody who's credible to talk about this and persuasive to talk about this? And then pathos. So, you know, what does this audience, you know, who might they be? What might they connect to? So if you're going to use, say, pop culture references, you know, those vary a lot these days depending on the age of people or their geographical location. So you might want to think about things that are more broadly appealing if you're writing to people of a variety of ages. If not, if you have a certain, like, say, a younger generation in mind, you might be able to be a bit more specific. It's also fun to think about how you might potentially open your piece. So, you know, what might that lead look like? And what would your call to action potentially be? What would you ask people to do? So, you know, there's quite a few different ways into thinking about your op-ed, but I think any of these could be fruitful. I feel like maybe the top and bottom are a little easier, sort of topic and story, and then opening and call to action. But from there, then it might be nice to think about sort of those rhetorical appeals and to move into those. So yeah, I think it would be great if you can think on these things for a little bit, maybe jot down notes that you have. And from there, I think we'll plan to move into breakout rooms for people to be able to talk and share ideas and think about, you know, have a first chance to sort of test the waters with your persuasive writing or thinking for writing. Any questions right now for me as you are thinking about this?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
In terms of like finding like places to pitch to, like, would you recommend just like putting out pitches to a bunch of different websites and news places, or like would you recommend, I don't know, like specializing it to things that you think would like fit your piece best?
Yeah, this is a great question. So it's going to be important to make a little list of like what you think would be sort of good places to persuade people, I guess. So it's going to be, yeah, I think it's good to think about where you might find an audience for it or where you most want it to be heard and understood. Also think about where you think you could get it published. So often when I've talked about op-eds, I'm talking with undergraduate students who haven't necessarily had much writing published. So they're often thinking about pitching to, you know, the student papers, maybe like a municipal paper. So I think it's good to have a list. And then one of the rules of pitching op-eds is that you need to give the different publications time to consider and turn around and give you an answer. So a lot of them have in their guidelines that they only want, you know, it needs to be distinct to them that they would publish the piece. So you couldn't have the same op-ed in a bunch of papers appearing at the same time. There's rules against doing that, or sort of unofficial rules against doing that. So you'll want to think about, you know, do you think this could be published in the New York Times? And if so, you need to give them, I think it's 48 hours to respond to you. And if they don't, then you can move on to place number 2. And because these are, I had an undergrad student once who made a list of like 20 publications with the New York Times at the top, and he went through them all, and he did get it published eventually. But it was like this beautiful sort of logical system that he went through. what was I going to say next? So, so that will be important. And the other thing is that because a lot of op-eds are timed to a news story, so there's sort of like a news event, and then a lot of people submit op-eds on that topic, you don't necessarily want to go to the New York Times as your first one, because you could potentially waste a couple of days waiting for them. So you might want to be like, realistically, where do I think this can go? And then to pitch to there. So when I published that analysis piece that I keep mentioning, I had a bit of a link to one of the editors at the National Observer. So I'd said, I've been working on this, there's an announcement due. And then on the day that it came out, I was like, it was just announced. I'm sending you the piece in 2 hours. And so we kind of went through and had a bit of a back and forth until it was published later that day. But I could see even on their Twitter feed, they were sort of already tweeting the news story about the announcement at McGill to sort of like get readers interested. So these things move on a very swift scale sometimes. And I know like I was teaching a course that day. And so there's a lot happening that I was like, it's important to me. So I'm going to juggle this, but it is important to sort of have a bit of a plan or a bit of an order to go about in that way. I didn't talk as much about pitching, but we will send you out these guidelines. And it has, like, most pitching is done by email. Sometimes publications have forms that they ask you to complete and submit, but generally a lot of them do want to see a written piece. So it doesn't hurt to like be writing your pieces. It's The Guardian is the main exception that I know of, where they'd like to go back and forth with people to decide, on how exactly this should go. And in an email, you'll want to have like a subject line that's very clear about what it is that you're pitching. And maybe it's even like a key line from your op-ed that you've written. And then people will paste underneath their pitch, they'll paste in what piece they've written so far, just so that the editor can quickly scroll down, see the text, have a sense of the writing, and then go from there. So there's a bit of a system to it. There's a lot on this on the op-ed project too, but we will send out this document that I've put together too. Thank you for asking that one. I know I kind of diverted it to my own sharing of information, but other questions people have?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So I'm doing my PhD at the moment in anthropology, and I'm a filmmaker. So I'm trying to look for ways to weave film and writing together, which can be really challenging, but it's interesting. I wonder how, or if you see a possibility to use op-eds to actually talk about a film and how it's still relevant today, but like, how could I possibly frame or use a film to make a point, I don't know, about sexual violence or race or whatever how I narrow down the topic. But do you see this as a possibility, or should I necessarily have to go towards a film critic kind of format?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. And this is the kind of conversation we can have in breakout rooms in a minute too. But just a quick response is, yeah, I think that's a fascinating topic. Like, I think visuals are so powerful in our society. To have somebody who's doing research in this area sort of speak to sort of the effects or the sort of persuasive qualities, or some of the benefits. Like, I'm sure you're reading research on this topic too that you could kind of share. I would say that often, I know when I took that first session with the op-ed project, I was early in my dissertation, or early in writing my PhD dissertation, and I really kind of wanted to write my dissertation topic as an op-ed, and I definitely had to like narrow down and find like a more kind of like palatable angle. So it often isn't, sort of your broad thesis that you might write, but something that's like catching the public interest. And if you do think about where you might want this to go, like if there's sort of potential publications or platforms, especially that are engaging about the power of visuals, I think you can kind of see what's been published already and sort of see the size of things, like kind of what's the scope, and like how you might be able to turn this topic into something that's like of a good angle. Like that's sort of the X is the topic and the Y is the way in. So I think that could be really, really powerful. Yeah. And yeah, I don't think you need to go just like film critic ways at all. You're, the world's your oyster. And this is the thing about like the op-ed project too, is like they, really it's better to hear from more people. So even if you're like, oh, my thing's not quite the right shape, it's like, it doesn't have to be an exact shape. Like it's worth putting it out there. A lot of editors are interested in sort of new takes or new ways of expressing too. And I know that structure I shared with you is quite stringent, but it's sort of like, know that's a common structure and then think about how to use it, but also how to play around with it. It's like, there's a lot of potential there, I think.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right. So I'm thinking it's probably best to go into rooms of about 3 people. So it's not too big. There's not too much to share. So in a second, I'll just open those rooms and we can move into them. And we'll plan to come back and talk together. So you just be about 15 minutes in the room. So try to make sure everyone gets like at least sort of 5 minutes on their topic. For anyone who needs to leave now, it's been, really nice to engage with you in this way and look for some follow-up materials to be sent your way. And it's, share your voice, express yourself. This is a great mode to do it. There's a lot of, it can take, for a short period of time, you might be very busy putting something together, but the effects of doing it are profound, not just for you, but for, the broader population. So it's great. Please do. I'm your cheerleader, and I would love to hear from you about it. So I'll make sure my email address is in the resources we shared too. Okay.
Oh, Diane, I just wanted to mention just before because some people will stay for the breakout and some won't. First of all, thank you for this great talk. We're going to stop the recording in a moment. So the following stuff won't be recorded, but I also want to let you know that because there, one thing that you mentioned too was that like sometimes backlash of certain op-eds come up. We're going to have an event with Dr. Jennifer Lundquist on addressing the digital harassment and trolling of scholars on November 17th. So also to kind of address sometimes the backlash that can happen of doing public scholarship too. So for people who are still on the Zoom call, so they can find out more about that. But so just for that moment of promo, but Ty, I think we can stop the recording.